The general stood on the balcony of the human capital, her eyes fixed on the endless stars that stretched across the sky like a silent ocean. She had lived her life among them, commanding fleets that carved paths through the void, yet on this night, they looked different, colder, more distant. She had been praised as a hero, awarded medals that glittered like suns in the great halls of the Republic, and feared by her enemies, who whispered her name like a storm approaching. Her presence carried the weight of history, but none of that mattered now, for her thoughts were not on battles or politics. They were on the 3 small lives, sleeping in the nursery behind her. She had never believed she would become a mother. War had consumed every part of her soul, leaving little space for softness, but fate had other plans. The triplets came into her life, like a blaze of light breaking through the iron walls she had built around her heart. Each child was a reflection of her strength and her vulnerability. Their tiny breaths, the sound of hope itself. When she looked into their eyes, she saw not only her future but the future of humanity itself, and in that fragile quiet she found a peace she had never known on any battlefield. Yet peace is never safe in a galaxy ruled by power and fear. The Empire had watched her for years, tracking her victories, studying her every move. She was not only a soldier to them, she was a symbol that could inspire rebellion, a symbol that could topple thrones, and they feared symbols more than they feared armies, for symbols live in the hearts of people, and hearts cannot be conquered. So, icily, the Emperor had made his decision long before the night arrived. If he could not break the general, he would break the very core of her being, and force her to kneel. The first signs were subtle, a ripple in the air, a flicker in the shadows. Her instincts, sharpened by years of war, told her danger was near. She turned her gaze to the sky, and saw nothing but stars. Yet the unease deepened. Her hand brushed the edge of the rail, her fingers tightening as if gripping a weapon she no longer carried. Within the nursery, the triplets stirred, as though they too sensed the storm that was coming. Then it began. A hum, low and deep, filled the night. The sky cracked with the sudden descent of Imperial craft. Black wings slicing through the darkness, they moved with the silence of predators. Engines cloaked their forms, blotting out constellations with cold iron. Her heart froze, not in fear but in fury. She spun and rushed inside. Alarms began to wail across the city, but too late. The Empire was already here. Shadows poured into her home, armored figures, gliding through corridors like ghosts, their movements sharp, their intent merciless. She fought like a storm, her hands striking with the memory of 1,000 battles, but she was unarmed, caught in her most vulnerable moment. Still she did not yield. Her voice thundered through the halls as she roared at the invaders, her body a shield between them and her children. But the Empire was endless, their numbers drowning her in waves of steel and fire. She reached the nursery door and saw her triplets crying, their tiny hands reaching for her, and her soul shattered into 1,000 blades as the Empire took them. The nursery was filled with the desperate cries of her children and the heavy boots of soldiers who did not know mercy. Their armor gleamed black in the dim light, their visors hiding eyes that could never understand the love of a mother. They moved with mechanical precision, lifting the triplets from their cradles as though they were nothing more than objects to be carried away. Her body lunged forward, fueled by a rage that had carried her through decades of war. But this time her arms were empty. She had no weapon, no blade, no rifle, only the fire in her heart. She struck with fists and fury, every blow landing with the weight of her sorrow and her fury. But the soldiers were trained. They did not falter. One of them slammed her back against the wall, the crack of bone echoing through the room. But she did not care. Pain was nothing compared to the sight of her children being pulled away, their cries slicing deeper than any wound she had ever taken. Her hands clawed at the ground, her voice breaking as she screamed for them to stop. But the soldiers were deaf to her pleas. Outside the city, alarms roared across the capital, towers of steel lit with emergency beacons. The people watched the sky as black ships rose like shadows, blotting out the stars. No one dared resist, for the Empire ruled with iron and fire, and defiance was a death sentence. But whispers began to stir among them. Whispers of the general whose children had been stolen by the Empire, whispers that carried like sparks in dry grass. She fought to her last breath in that nursery, until her body collapsed, her vision blurred by blood and smoke, and still she dragged herself across the floor toward the door, where the Empire vanished into the night, carrying her children into the abyss. She pressed her hand to the cold metal, her nails tearing as she scraped against it, as though she could claw her way through her heart, pounding with the promise that she would never stop hunting them, never stop fighting, until her arms held her children again. When the soldiers were gone, silence fell heavy and suffocating. The cradles stood empty, rocking gently, as though mocking her. The room that once felt alive with warmth now echoed with loss. She sat in the ruins, her chest heaving, her eyes hollow, her body trembling. She wanted to scream until the stars shattered. She wanted to tear the empire down with her bare hands. The fire inside her had not died, it had only begun to burn brighter. The empire believed they had broken her, but they had awakened something far more dangerous than a soldier. They had awakened a mother, whose love was fiercer than any weapon forged in steel. She rose from the floor, covered in blood and dust, her voice hoarse but unbroken. She swore to the stars themselves that she would burn every world, if it meant finding her children again, and in that vow, her war against the empire was born. The general lay in the ruins of her home, her body battered, her spirit torn, yet her mind refused to surrender. Grief had struck her like a blade through the heart, but grief alone could not contain the storm that raged within her. She felt the weight of every loss pressing down, yet beneath it rose something sharper than sorrow, sharper than despair. It was fury. It was the vow of a mother who had been robbed of her blood, and she swore that no force in the galaxy would stop her from tearing the empire apart. Piece by piece she stood, her legs trembling but her eyes burning with fire. The city beyond her balcony was in chaos, lights flashing, alarms wailing, the skies alive with imperial shadows vanishing into the black void with her children. She could feel the stares of her people upon her, some filled with pity, some with fear, and others with a quiet hope that she would not fall, for she was not only their general, she was their strength, their symbol, their shield, and now she was also their fury embodied. The whispers spread faster than fire across the colonies. The empire had stolen the children of the general, the mother of the people, and with every whisper came anger, with every whisper came defiance. The people who had once bent their knees in silence now clenched their fists in secret, their hearts waiting for the signal that the war to reclaim freedom had begun. And though the empire had intended to shatter her, they had instead created the very spark they feared most, a spark that could ignite rebellion across the stars. She gathered herself and walked through the shattered halls of her home, every step echoing like a drumbeat of war, the walls scarred by battle, the cradles empty but her resolve unbroken. Her soldiers came to her wounded and shaken, their eyes searching her face for command, for direction. She looked at them with the eyes of a leader and the eyes of a mother, and spoke. No words, only a silent vow that every single one of them understood. Without needing to hear, they saluted her, not as a general only, but as the living embodiment of defiance. The empire believed her too broken to rise again, but in truth, they had only reforged her, stronger than ever before. Her mind sharpened into strategy, her rage transformed into discipline, her grief forged into determination. She no longer fought for medals or for history. She fought for the voices of her children that had been silenced. She fought for the stolen warmth of their tiny hands. She fought for every mother who had ever lost to the cruelty of power, and in that fight she became something greater than a soldier. She became unstoppably as the night bled into dawn. She stood upon the balcony once more, the stars fading into light, and raised her hand, not in surrender but in declaration. The empire had started this war, but she would end it. She would hunt them to the edge of the galaxy. She would burn their fleets, she would crush their thrones, and she would not stop until her children were back in her arms, alive and free. Her war had begun, and the galaxy would tremble before the fury of a mother. The days that followed were filled with fire and silence, the fire of her rage, burning hotter with each sunrise, and the silence of her thoughts as she began to weave a plan. She knew she could not fight the empire alone, no matter how sharp her, no matter how deep her fury. An army was needed, but not the kind that wore polished uniforms or marched beneath banners of pride. She needed an army of ghosts, an army of the forgotten, an army that would bleed for the promise of freedom and vengeance. She moved through the hidden corners of the capital, her once luminous presence now cloaked in shadows. She spoke to deserters who had fled the cruelty of imperial command. She spoke to smugglers who knew the secret routes between stars. She spoke to miners whose families had been crushed beneath the weight of imperial chains. Every word she gave them was heavy with truth. She did not promise them glory, she did not promise them riches, she promised them war. She promised them a chance to strike back at the hand that had beaten them for so long, and in her eyes they saw conviction so fierce it could not be denied. Her loyal soldiers followed her without question. These were men and women who had served under her banner for years, who had seen her bleed, who had seen her rise after every fall. They were bound to her not by duty, but by love and respect, and now by the grief that they all shared for her children. were not only hers, they were theirs, symbols of innocence, stolen by an empire of cruelty, and so they too swore that they would fight until the stars themselves turned cold slowly. Her force began to form a hidden resistance. Scattered across systems and planets, they struck with precision and silence, hitting where the Empire was weakest. They cut supply lines, leaving fleets stranded. They destroyed communications, leaving commanders blind. They freed prisoners who became soldiers in her ranks. Every strike was a whisper of her name, every victory a reminder that the Empire was not untouchable, and the whispers spread until they became shouts, and the shouts became a chorus echoing across the galaxy. The Empire responded with fury, unleashing fleets of iron warships to hunt her resistance-burning colonies, suspected of sheltering her people, but the more they crushed, the more her movement grew. For every world destroyed, two more rose in defiance. She had become more than a general now. She was legend. Mothers told her story to their children. Rebels painted her image on the walls of cities, and even imperial soldiers spoke her name in hushed tones. For to fight her was to face death itself. Yet, beneath the legend, she remained a mother haunted by the cries of her triplets, her dreams filled with their faces, her waking hours consumed with the thought of them. Every battle, every plan, every victory was a step toward them. She carried their memory as both weapon and shield. She knew the Empire thought it had broken her, but in truth it had given her something stronger than duty, something stronger than loyalty. It had given her a reason to fight beyond life itself. And so the general stood at the heart of her growing rebellion, her eyes fixed on the stars. She knew her children were out there, somewhere beyond the black horizon, and she swore that no empire, no emperor, no army forged of steel would keep her from reaching them. The strikes came swift and merciless. The resistance moved like a shadow across the galaxy, striking in places the Empire thought untouchable. No sooner had an imperial convoy entered a quiet trade route than fire rained upon it from hidden ships. No sooner had a fortress declared itself unbreakable than explosions tore through its walls, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. The general led them with the precision of a master strategist, every move planned like a blade cutting through flesh. Her enemies never saw her coming until it was already too late. Fuel depots burned like suns, lighting the night skies with flames so high they could be seen from orbit. Communication towers crumbled into dust, leaving entire sectors blind. Prisoners, locked in cages of iron, were freed and joined her, cause their eyes burning with the same fire that burned in hers. Everywhere she struck, the Empire felt its grip weaken, and everywhere she struck her legend grew, her face painted on the walls of ruined cities, her story whispered by children hiding in the rubble. She was no longer just a general, she was a symbol, and symbols cannot be killed. Among her soldiers, there was a new kind of loyalty, one not born of rank or command, but of love and faith. They did not simply follow her, they believed in her with every fiber of their being. They saw the pain in her eyes, they heard the silence in her voice when she thought of her children, and they knew that their fight was not only for freedom, but for the heart of a mother. And so they bled willingly, they marched into fire willingly, because they knew that if she could endure, then so could they. The Empire could not ignore her any longer. Whispers of the phantom general spread through the ranks of their army's commanders, who once laughed at the thought of rebellion, now trembled in their war rooms, maps marked with red where she had struck again and again. The Emperor himself grew restless, sending orders to crush her at any cost. Entire fleets were unleashed, entire planets punished for daring to shelter her. Yet, the harder they struck, the stronger she became. For every world they burned, two more rose in rebellion, their voices chanting her name. Like a war cry, her strikes were not mindless rage, they were calculated, every move a message, every victory a seed planted in the soil of despair. She wanted the Empire to feel her presence, not just in their losses but in their fear. She wanted them to wake each night wondering where she would strike next. She wanted the Emperor to know that the mother he had tried to break was coming for him, and for the chains he had wrapped around her children. Still, in the quiet moments between battles, when the fires dimmed and the soldiers rested, she would close her eyes and hear the cries of her triplets. She would imagine their tiny hands reaching for her, and she would feel the ache in her chest sharpen into resolve, for every strike was not only against the Empire, it was a step closer to them, and she would not stop. She could not stop until the day she held them again. The Empire struck back with the fury of a wounded beast. Entire fleets of iron warships poured into the skies of colonies that had whispered her name, their cannons raining fire upon cities, their engines blotting out the sun. Worlds trembled beneath the crushing weight of imperial vengeance, but still, the resistance did not falter. For every building turned to ash, there was a child who survived to carry the memory of defiance. For every soldier who fell, there were 2 more who rose from the shadows, swearing vengeance in the name of the general. The emperor ordered entire sectors purged, believing terror would silence the people, yet terror only fed the flame. His cruelty created martyrs, and martyrs fueled legends, and legends gave the people courage. The general knew this truth. She had lived it. She understood that the more the empire punished, the more the galaxy would rise. Her strategies became sharper, her strikes more precise. She made the empire bleed, not just in bodies and steel but in spirit. Each victory was a reminder to the people that the empire was not eternal. It could be broken. The resistance fought battles that seemed impossible, outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, yet every time they found a way to endure. Her soldiers fought not because they believed they could survive, but because they believed in her. She led from the front, her presence a storm on the battlefield, her voice cutting through the chaos like thunder. She fought not as a commander sitting behind walls, but as a mother fighting for her children, and her soldiers saw that and gave everything they had in return. Still, the cost was heavy. Worlds burned, allies fell, and with each loss the weight on her heart grew heavier. She stood over the graves of her soldiers, their names carved into stone, her face carved with grief. She knew she was asking them to risk everything for her cause, yet they never wavered, because they understood what the empire had done to her, and what the empire had done to them. She carried their memory into every battle, their sacrifices becoming the blood that fueled her. Raged the empire called her a terrorist, the emperor called her a traitor, but the people called her a savior. Her name carried across the stars, carried in songs, carried in prayers, carried in the trembling voices of those who dared to dream of freedom. She had become more than flesh and blood. She was myth. She was fire. She was the storm that the empire could not cage on. Yet when the battlefields fell silent, when the stars above were clear of fire, she sat alone with her thoughts, her mind drifting back to her children. She wondered if they were safe, if they were cold, if they cried for her at night. She wondered if they remembered. Her face, and the pain of that wondering was sharper than any blade, but instead of breaking her, it forged her into steel. She rose from the silence, each time stronger, each time more determined. The empire thought that crushing worlds would break her, but they failed to see the truth. She was not fighting for territory or power. She was fighting for love. And love is the most dangerous weapon in any galaxy. Legends spread like wildfire across the galaxy, stories of the human woman who defied the empire, traveled from colony to colony, from mining station to drifting outpost. Her name became a whisper of hope, her face painted on the walls of slums and carved into the stone of caves where rebels hid. Children listened wide-eyed as their parents spoke of the general who rose after her triplets were stolen, and fought with the strength of 1,000 warriors. She was no longer just a soldier in their eyes. She was a myth alive, a living flame that no darkness could smother. Her soldiers carried her legend further with every strike. They returned not only with supplies or victories, but with tales of her courage, tales of how she faced impossible odds and did not break, tales of how her presence on the battlefield turned fear into courage. Men and women who once cowered before imperial authority now stood tall, believing that if she could face the empire, then so could they. She had become the spark that turned fear into defiance, and defiance into open rebellion. Among the empire, her name grew heavier in whispers. Soldiers spoke of her as if she were a phantom who appeared in fire and vanished in smoke. Commanders warned their troops to remain vigilant, for to underestimate her was to die. Entire fleets trembled at the thought of her strategies for war. She had turned the chaos of war into an art form. She struck where she was least expected and vanished before the empire could close its grip. She was everywhere and nowhere, and that made her unstoppable. But her legend was not built on stories alone. It was built on sacrifice. She bled for every victory. She wept for every soldier lost. She carried the weight of every life that fought beside her. She did not pretend to be invincible. She did not hide her grief, and that truth made her legend even stronger. For the people saw her not as a flawless hero, but as one of them, a mother broken yet unyielding, a warrior scarred yet unbroken. Songs were written in her name, sung in secret gatherings by those who still feared the empire, and shouted in open defiance by those who no longer did. Murals painted her holding her triplets in her arms, a vision of hope that carried across the stars. She had become the heart of a movement larger than herself. And though the empire tried to erase her, they only made her stronger. For every poster they tore down, 10 more were painted. For every voice they silenced, 10 more rose to speak. Yet in the quiet corners of her soul, she knew the truth. The legend was powerful, but it was not enough. She did not fight to be remembered, she did not fight to inspire, she fought to bring her children home. The whispers, the songs, the murals gave her strength, but her heart remained haunted by the absence of their touch, by the silence of their voices. She knew the galaxy saw her as a savior, but she was still a mother, searching for her children, and she would not rest until she found them manned. So the legend of the general grew brighter, but within the legend burned a truth sharper than fire. This was not just rebellion, this was not just war, this was a mother's promise, and that promise was unbreakable. Through blood and fire, through the whispers of spies and the secrets stolen from trembling prisoners, the general at last uncovered the truth. The triplets were alive, hidden deep within the heart of the Empire itself. The revelation struck her like a blade, yet it was not despair that followed, it was a fire that roared higher than ever before. She had known all along that her children still lived, she had felt it in her soul, in every battle, in every sleepless night, and now the proof was before her, carved in reports stolen from the hands of imperial captains. They were not only alive, they were guarded with the cruel precision of the emperor himself, hidden in the imperial fortress that towered above the capital world, a fortress of black stone and iron surrounded by fleets that could blot out the sun, its walls filled with soldiers who would kill without hesitation. It was said that no one had ever broken into that fortress and lived it. Was said that even the stars themselves bowed before its shadow, but the general did not care. She would walk through fire, she would tear the galaxy apart, she would break the unbreakable walls if it meant holding her children again. The spies told her of the chambers where the triplets were kept, not as prisoners but as weapons in waiting. The Empire planned to shape them, to bend them, to twist them into tools of fear. Children raised not with love but with chains. The thought clawed at her soul, it filled her veins with rage and dread, yet also with resolve. She would not allow her children to be turned into shadows of the Empire. She would not allow them to grow in the cold halls of cruelty. They were hers, they were the future of humanity, and she would not let the Empire steal their destiny. She called her commanders together, her closest allies, men and women who had fought at her side through fire and ruin. She told them the truth, her voice steady, her eyes burning. She did not hide the danger, she did not hide the cost. She spoke plainly that to enter the imperial fortress was to walk into death, and yet not one soldier turned away. Not one hesitated. They swore as one that they would follow her into the heart of the storm, because her children had become their children, because her vow had become their vow. The plan was set, each strike, each movement, measured with the precision of a blade. They would gather ships from hidden fleets, they would call upon allies from distant colonies, they would weave a storm so vast the Empire would not see the dagger hidden within its heart, for the general knew this battle would not only decide the fate of her children, it would decide the fate of the rebellion itself. If she could shatter the fortress, if she could tear her children from its grasp, then the Empire would no longer be feared, it would be broken. She stood beneath the stars that night, her soldiers gathered in silence around her. She lifted her eyes to the dark sky and whispered a vow, not to the rebellion, not to the galaxy, but to her children. She was coming, no matter the cost, no matter the blood. She was coming, and nothing in the universe would stop her. The final war began beneath a burning sky. Fleets of rebellion, ships rising from the shadows like a storm, long awaited their engines roaring, their weapons blazing as they hurled themselves against the endless steel of the Imperial Armada. The stars themselves vanished behind the fire of battleships, collided in bursts of flame metal, tearing apart like thunder across the void. The Empire unleashed every weapon, every commander, every force at its command, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. But the general stood at the front of it all, her eyes locked on the fortress that towered in the distance, her heart beating with the rhythm of war and love. Her flagship carved a path through the chaos, its cannons tearing through Imperial cruisers, her voice steady as she commanded her soldiers, her fury unshaken, every order precise, every strike deliberate. She fought not for conquest, not for power, but for her children, and her soldiers knew this. They followed her not because they believed they would live, but because they believed she would succeed. She was not simply leading them into battle, she was carrying them into history. The fortress loomed ahead, a mountain of black iron surrounded by fire. Her ship pierced through its defenses, her soldiers stormed the corridors, every step a song of defiance, every strike a promise, kept the general moved through the halls like a storm. Her blade flashing, her rifle burning, her enemies falling before her. She was unstoppable, fueled by years of grief and love, each step carrying her closer to the chamber where her children were held. The Imperial captains tried to bar her path, their blades clashing, their voices roaring, yet none could hold her. Her rage was too fierce, her love too strong. She carved her way through them with the strength of a mother who had nothing left to lose. Her soldiers fell beside her, but still they pressed on, their voices shouting her name, their blood paving the way to destiny, until at last she reached the doors of the chamber guarded by the most loyal of the Emperor's knights. The battle was savage, steel clashing, fire burning, but the general did not falter. She moved with the precision of a warrior and the fury of a mother. Her enemies fell one by one until the doors lay shattered before her, and within the chamber she saw them, her triplets, small yet alive, their eyes wide as they looked upon her, their tiny hands reaching out as if they had always known she would. Tears burned her face as she gathered them into her arms, holding them against her chest. Their cries soft, their warmth real. At last, the years of fire and blood had brought her here. To this moment she whispered to them a vow that she would never let them be taken again, never let the Empire touch them again. And in that moment the walls of the fortress shook as the rebellion outside thundered with victory. The Empire had crumbled, its fleets shattered, its fortress broken, and at the heart of it all stood the general, her children safe in her arms, her people rising in triumph. The galaxy had witnessed her fury. The galaxy had witnessed her love, and from that day forward the Empire was no longer feared for the mother who defied. The stars had reclaimed her children, and in doing so she had ignited a hope that no darkness could ever extinguish.